Chatterbait fishing is one of my favorite types of bass fishing that we do. The chatterbait is just a very unique lure. It's a lure that you can catch not only a big bass on, but you can just catch a lot of fish on a chatterbait. And something that I really love about a chatterbait is that it works year round. It can work in water that's really cold, like upper 40s, low 50-degree water temps, and it can also work in the hottest temperatures that you're going to find. And if you fish bass tournaments, you may realize that pretty much over the last decade, chatterbaits have been dominating a lot of tournaments.
So it is extremely important to know everything there is to know about a chatterbait or a bladed jig. So in this video, we are first going to fish the chatterbait for about 5 minutes. Then I'm actually going to take you under the water and we're going to listen to different brands of bladed jigs and see what they sound like under the water. Then of those different brands, I'm actually going to tell you which I think are the best, the ones that I choose to use day in and day out. And after that, we're going to talk about how to keep your chatterbait color simple and what guidelines I use to choosing the right color. Then after that, I'm going to tell you about the perfect chatterbait combo, the exact equipment that you need to fish this bait. And then we're going to talk about probably the biggest chatterbait mistake that guys make. And after all that, I'm going to talk real specifically about when, where, and how to fish this bait. So let's dive right into it. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. Not only can you get different bladed jigs at Sportsman's Outfitters, but you can get all your other tackle and hunting gear. And right now at Sportsman's Outfitters, there is still a ton of Christmas sales going on. So you can save a lot of money by purchasing some of your favorite lures right now at Sportsman's Outfitters. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, click those links down below in the description and shop at Sportsman's Outfitters today.
I think I got the line up now. There's a clump of grass just up ahead of me that sticks out, and on the very end there's a bluegill bed. And I'm just kind of bringing this mini backs right on the tip of that clump of grass, and it seems like if I hit the tip, I catch a fish just like that. Just like that. Oh gosh. If I hit the tip of it, I catch a bass. If I get too much into the grass, it just kind of gets hung up. Not really fighting that hard. Woo! Here we go, baby. Another just chunk fish, man. I think we got them fired up now. Let's see if we can't keep catching them. There he is. Golly. I think I got the line up now. That feels like another good one. Oh yeah, baby. Yes, sir. God, I mean, that guy, he has this whole lake and just comes over here and runs over my literally the grass patch I'm fishing. Golly, that sucker is pulling. Ooh, gosh, that's bigger than the last one. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Look at that. Gosh, that is a beautiful, thick bass right there. Look at that thing. Let's go ahead and let that fish go. Now, what I'm actually doing with this bait is what I call feathering it. So I'm going to cast it out, and I usually do this when I'm fishing it around grass. It's a little bit different than actually ripping that bait out of grass. I'm really fishing it kind of slow and methodical. Now it's about on the bottom, so I'm just going to fish it. I'll just kind of pull it and let it sink like this, and every now and then it'll get in the grass like that. I'll pull it. Just a little bit slower way of fishing that bait, but man, I've seen it be really effective in deep grass. There he is. Golly, just feathering it again. Feels like a good one. Oh gosh, that feels like a big one. I just love this technique. I love this chatterbait. This feels like a big one. Come on, baby, stay on there. Stay on there. Getting ready to jump. Don't you do it. I haven't seen him yet. Oh yeah, that's a good one. Well, he's got a little grass on him, not as big as I thought. Let's go. Whoo! Solid fish right there. Solid fish. You can see though, he got that bait again. Gosh, it's so much fun. Look how thick and fat those fish are. I think I'm gonna get about one more cast over here And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go on the other side and cast this way. Sometimes just simply changing up your angle gives those bass a little bit different look, and sometimes it can make a huge difference. I think these fish are also starting to get used to this rattling noise down there. Oh gosh, maybe not. Yeah, bomb. Oh gosh. Lee, did he crack that thing. Oh my gosh, it's a good one. It's one of the better ones I've seen. There you go, guys. Woo! It's exactly what I'm talking about. Golly, he ate that. Look at that. I came to the other side, and literally the second cast, I popped one. I'm gonna actually move up just a little bit more. But look at that. That is a freaking chunk right there. Every bit about 2.5, 3.
Now with so many different brands of chatterbaits, let's dive under the water and see exactly what these sound like. These chatterbaits are all awesome, but I keep my chatterbait selection pretty simple, and there's really 3 different chatterbaits that I use most of the time. And they all happen to be in the chatterbait family of bladed jigs. The jackhammer, the big blade, and the mini max. Now the jackhammer is really my go-to bait. No matter what lake I go to, if I think there is a chatterbait bite going on, usually I pick up the jackhammer first. And then from there, if I kind of start getting some bites, I will experiment with the other type of bladed jigs. But I almost always start with a jackhammer because I just have a ton of confidence with this bait. Now, unfortunately, the jackhammer is a little bit expensive, but it really does come with premium products. And the best thing about a chatterbait is you don't lose a lot of them, so you can really catch a lot of fish on that jackhammer. Now, the big blade chatterbait is one that I don't pick up as much as those other baits, but it seems like if they are on the big blade, you catch the biggest fish in your lake. Now, the few situations that I like to use that big blade in are during the pre-spawn of the year, when it seems like you have dirtier water a lot of times during the pre-spawn, and fish just seem to like a lot of hard vibration during that time of the year too. So I always have this tied up in the pre-spawn. The other situation that I always have the big blade tied up is when I'm fishing for big fish. If you are fishing a lake that just has a bigger average bass, that is when I'm gonna pick up the big blades. Now, if you guys have been around the channel, you know that I have really fallen in love with the Mini Max over the last couple of months. This is a bladed jig that is really just more of a finesse bladed jig. It has a lot smaller profile to it. But with that being said, I can still fish it on my same chatterbait rod and line configuration. Now, the reason that I love the Mini Max so much is because I fish around fish that get a ton of pressure. And we have a lot of tough conditions in Ohio, and I have seen that this chatterbait will get bit when your standard chatterbait, like the original or even the jackhammer, will not get bit. So this is just something that I have kept on the front deck of my boat for a while now. Now, one of the biggest questions that I get on the channel is, what are your favorite trailers for a chatterbait? And these are the 3 that I use nearly 100% of the time. I have a Strike King caffeine shad, I have a Yamamoto Seiko, and I also have a Strike King structure bug. Now, I use a structure bug when I am fishing a chatterbait around wood cover. This makes a huge difference in actually being able to get that bait to come through the wood without hanging up. I typically cut a triangle into the bait right above these wings, and then I pinch these wings off, and that is what my trailer is. The important thing about this is the way that you feed the trailer onto your chatterbait. And you're actually gonna wanna make sure that when you put that trailer on, that the trailer is laying perpendicular to the hook. So I'm going to stick the hook in the top, and I'm gonna feed the trailer hook on just like this, and that hook is going to come out right about where that last ring ends. Because that trailer lays perpendicular to the hook, as it goes over brush, it will actually come over it without it rolling and getting hung. So if you're fishing around wood cover, try a structure bug. Now the next trailer that I use a lot is just this Yamamoto Seiko. This was actually designed for a bladed jig, and I think that it works extremely well. Anytime I'm fishing the bait in the open or around grass, that is when I'm gonna pick up the Yamamoto Seiko. Now I like to fish the Seiko on the big blade and the jackhammer or the original chatterbait. But if I'm fishing a mini max, that is when I pick up the Strike King caffeine shad. If you look at the top or the back of this caffeine shad, you can see that there is a hook slot. Now I'm actually gonna go about an inch above where that hook slot ends, and I'm going to cut that bait about in half. This little section is what you are left with, and I'm simply going to cut off the belly of this bait just like that. Now if you look at what you are left with, you have a flat side and you have a round side. I like the round side to be on the bottom side of my chatterbait. So when I rig up that mini max, I am going to make sure that the round side ends up on the bottom of that bladed jig. One of the most important things you can do with a chatterbait is keep your color selection simple. So let's talk about colors of chatterbaits right now. One of my favorite colors, and probably the most popular color of all time, is your simple green pumpkin style chatterbait. This is the one that I use a lot. Pretty much anytime I'm fishing really clear water, I'm gonna pick up a green pumpkin chatterbait. Now the only time I won't pick up the green pumpkin in clear water is if I know that the bass are feeding heavily on shad, which may be during a shad spawn, or if you catch a couple of bass and they're spitting up shad, that's when I'll switch over to something that is shad color or white, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But like I said, the green pumpkin, it's probably my favorite. It's probably the one that I throw the most. If I feel like I don't know what color to throw, I'm just gonna pick up the green pumpkin chatterbait. Now another place where the green pumpkin really shines is anytime you're fishing in ponds. If you are a bank angler, maybe you fish primarily in ponds, a lot of ponds are gonna have, you know, a foot, a 2 foot, 3 foot of visibility. Some of them can be really clear. And a lot of times your main forage in a pond is a bluegill. And a green pumpkin chatterbait is going to mimic that bluegill perfectly. Now, as far as my green pumpkin chatterbaits go, I prefer the blades on them that are painted, either green pumpkin or just like dark, like a black. Like this one is kind of just black. Like I said, when I'm fishing that green pumpkin chatterbait, a lot of times I'm mimicking a bluegill, and bluegills don't necessarily have a shiny, flashy head, so I don't always like a lot of flash. Now, the next color bladed jig that I throw a tremendous amount is some sort of baitfish color. Anytime that I fish a lake or reservoir where I know the bass are primarily feeding on shad, that's what I'm gonna pick up this baitfish color. Now, as you can see here, I have two different baitfish colored bladed jigs. This color over here is a little bit more translucent. This translucent color, and translucent just means that you can see through it, this is the one I'm gonna use when I'm fishing in really clear water. So if the bass are eating shad and they're in clear water, I'm gonna use that translucent color. Now, the more off color the water gets, the muddier it gets, I'm gonna lean towards that white that is opaque, right? You can't see through it. It's just very bright white. So if I know the bass are eating on shad, that's the color that I go with, and I'm just gonna change the shades depending on the water clarity. Those two colors alone honestly make up probably the majority of my bladed jig fishing. Now, the other colors that I'm about to show you are a little bit more situational. I have really specific times when I throw this specific color. Now, the first one is some sort of white and chartreuse color like this bladed jig right here. Now, the one situation that I really like a white and chartreuse bladed jig is when I'm fishing clear water for smallmouth. We all know that smallmouth actually really love chartreuse. I don't know what it is about them, whether it's their aggression, but it it seems like they really like chartreuse. So sometimes showing them a white and chartreuse bait like this, even in really clear water where it really stands out and almost doesn't make sense, the smallmouth can actually really like that bait. Now, sometimes chartreuse is too much for even a smallmouth. And if you see a lot of smallmouth that are following your bait in and not eating it, I'll typically switch over to a green pumpkin. Now, the next situational color that I love is a black and blue one. And when I am fishing dark conditions, so if I fish at night, this is a great bait. That black really silhouettes in the water. Now, if I'm fishing in just a dark day, some days you get up, it's really overcast, or maybe it's even raining. No matter what the fish are feeding on or the water clarity, a black and blue can work really well just because of that low light condition. Now, another time that the black and blue can just work really well is when you're fishing in that tannic colored water. We've talked about that a lot on this channel because I fished in Florida and I fished even in New York where there is tannic colored water. And when you get into that water, it looks like tea and it's very dark and the black and blue tends to shine. Now, the next color that I'm about to show you is a phenomenal color and it really works well during that late winter, early springtime. So if you guys don't have some of these colored bladed jigs, honestly, I would suggest that you get some because over the last couple of springs, this color has pretty much been sold out everywhere. And that is some sort of red or fire crawl. This fire crawl color really became popular when a couple of guys won some big tournaments on them. We had guys in the Bassmaster Classic doing really well on this fire crawl. And again, it is a later winter, early spring color for me. We all know that in pre-spawn, bass really like that red color. This bait, although it's super bright, it will catch bass during that time of the year, no matter the water clarity. If you're fishing muddy water, that fire crawl can catch them. If you're fishing really clear water, the fire crawl can still catch them. Now, as far as your weight size goes with a chatterbait, to me, I fish a 3/8 ounce or a 1/2 ounce chatterbait probably 95% of the time. Those are the two sizes that I like the most. Now, when I choose a 3/8 versus a 1/2 ounce really just depends on how fast I want that lure to come or how deep or shallow in the water column I want that lure to come. If I want to get that bait a little bit deeper in the water column, I'm going to step up to that 1/2 ounce bait. But sometimes you're fishing shallow, but you want that bait to really go super fast, and I'll keep that 1/2 ounce bait, but I'll just bring it a lot faster. That is a way that I really like to fish that white and chartreuse for smallmouth, is bringing that bait. Now, if I want to keep that bait a little bit higher in the water column without bringing it so fast, I'll bump it back up to that 3/8 ounce size. You can definitely fish bladed jigs that are less weight, 1/4 ounce weight, or you can fish bladed jigs that are more weight, that are 3/4 ounce, all the way up to over an ounce. But those are kind of special baits for special occasions.
The last thing any of us want to do is actually lose or miss fish when we are fishing a chatterbait. And after fishing a chatterbait for a number of years, I finally feel like I have the best combo, the perfect combo for a chatterbait. Now, to me, probably the most important thing about fishing a bladed jig, a chatterbait, is actually the rod that you use. And this is a question that I get a lot on the channel, is what rod do you use for fishing a chatterbait? When I first started fishing the bladed jig, I fished it on my jig rod, which was a 7-foot 3-inch medium heavy power fast action rod. And the reason that I fished it on that rod was because the bladed jig is a jig, right? But what I found is that although a bladed jig is just a jig with a blade on it, you want to use a really different style of rod than your jig rod. Now, I'll be 100% honest with you, I actually had a lot of success using that jig rod, but there were a few things that I noticed, and one of them was that when I would go to set the hook on a fish from time to time, I would hook into that fish for a split second and then he would come off. And that wasn't all the time, it was just every now and then. And also there were a few times where a big bass would come up to jump and I would actually lose him while fishing that jig rod. Now, of course, after I had some of these issues, I looked into what some of the big chatterbait fishermen use for their rod. The guys that are just known for fishing a chatterbait, what do they use? And literally every single person on that list used a more of a parabolic bending rod, a moderate action, and more specifically, they used a composite rod, a rod that was half graphite and half fiberglass. As soon as I made the switch to this composite rod,
the first thing that I noticed that on average, the fish that ate a chatterbait ate it a lot deeper. I had a lot more fish that were hooked deeper in the mouth and not towards the top of their mouth. I also noticed that those bites that I would get where I would set the hook, have that fish hooked for a split second and it came off, those pretty much disappeared. The thing about a bladed jig that is so much different than a regular jig is that it is constantly moving through the water. So when the bass go to inhale that bait, it is moving away from them. Now, the thing that you need to think about is when a bass goes to bite a lure, right, it's going to create negative pressure in its mouth. And when it opens its mouth up, it will suck that lure inside. So if that chatterbait is on the move and a bass is tracking it and then opens up its mouth, that chatterbait will actually start to slow down as that bass is sucking that bait in. Now, if you are using a graphite rod, a fast action graphite rod like a jig rod, you are going to feel that bass sucking that bait in a lot quicker, and therefore you're going to set the hook a little bit quicker, which means you're going to hook a lot of those bass towards the top of their mouth. And what I found out is that those fish that I was hooking and losing, they were probably just hooked in the skin of their lip and they would just pop off with a little bit of pressure. Now, when you're using that parabolic bin, that composite rod, when that fish goes to open its mouth and suck that bait in, you actually won't feel that fish suck that bait in quite as fast. So therefore that bass can actually get a hold of that bait before you go to set the hook. So I truly believe that a composite rod is going to help you to catch a lot more bass and land a lot more bass with a bladed jig or a chatterbait. Now, the exact chatterbait rod that I use is the Arc Tharp Series B Hitte rod. This is a composite rod. It is 7 foot 4 inches in length. It has a medium heavy power and a moderate fast action. Now, when it comes to a reel, I really like a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. That to me is the perfect chatterbait ratio. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, it's really just perfect. Now, this reel here is a Bruin ELS reel. It was designed by Paul Elias, and I love that it has 80 different brake settings on the side. Now, when it comes to the line itself, I use 20-pound fluorocarbon almost exclusively with a chatterbait. There are times where I want to get that bait a little bit deeper, and therefore I'm going to step down to something like 15-pound fluorocarbon to help me get a bait deeper. But most of the time, probably 90-95% of the time I'm throwing a bladed jig, it's 20-pound fluorocarbon. Now, real quickly, let's talk about the biggest chatterbait mistake that a lot of guys make. The first mistake that I see a lot of anglers make with a chatterbait is they simply go out, they take it out there, they cast the bait out, and they just reel it back in. They pick it out of the water, they cast it out, and they reel it back in. And that's all that they do. They don't impart any action on this bait at all. They simply just cast it out there and crank it in a medium fast retrieve. There are certain situations where you will catch bass doing that. We always want to maximize our lure's potential. We always want to try to catch as many fish as possible. Whether you're fishing a tournament, like the more fish you catch, the better chance you are at catching a big fish. Or maybe you're just out there fishing with your friends. Who doesn't want to go out there and beat all their friends even when they're throwing the exact same bait? Imparting a little bit of action on this bait will help you to get a lot more bites. What I'm talking about when I say imparting action on the bait, there's a couple of things that you can do to this bait as you're bringing it in, as you're retrieving it, to really help you trigger a lot more bites. Now, the first thing is speeding up the bait or slowing down the bait. Sometimes when you're just out there cranking it in, every now and then, just speed your reel up and then slow it back down. Speed that reel up and then slow it back down. Sometimes what happens is bass are actually following this bait. They're unsure if they want to actually eat it, and then all of a sudden it speeds off away from them. Kind of like a bait fish that realizes a bass is chasing them. And when it speeds off, that fish gets triggered. And then all of a sudden you slow it down and bam, that bass runs into it, he eats it. You just triggered that bass that may have not bit on the standard retrieve. This works with a number of other baits, not just a chatterbait. You know, I actually caught fish like this on a whopper plopper one time. The only reason I would even get bit with a whopper plopper is if I would speed it up and then slow it down. Bam, that's when I would get the bites. Another way you can impart action on this bait is letting the bait free fall. Now, anytime I'm fishing this bait, what I like to do is I really like to hit it off certain types of cover and then let the bait fall. I'm not gonna let the bait always fall to the bottom. I might just let that bait fall 1, 2, 3 foot. Literally just stop turning the reel handle for a split second or two, let that bait fall. If you think about a lot of different lures that we fish, a lot of times bass are hitting that lure on that fall. It's the same thing with this chatterbait. Most of the time you fish it horizontal, but if every now and then you hit it off a piece of grass, you let the bait fall, bam, that's when that fish is gonna get it. Or maybe you hit it off a dock post and you let it fall, bam, that's when that fish is gonna get it. Or you bring it over a lay down and you let that bait fall, that's when that fish is gonna get that. Now, to end this video, I wanna go a little bit more thoroughly into when, where, and how to fish a bladed jig. One of the best characteristics about a chatterbait is that it is a lure that you can use year-round. I've caught bass on bladed jigs and chatterbaits winter, spring, summer, fall, anytime that water temp is really above probably 46, 47 degrees and higher, you can catch bass on a chatterbait. That's really why I think it's so important that you understand everything there is about bladed jigs, because again, it's a lure that works at all times. So no matter where you go, no matter what kind of body of water you are fishing, you should just always have some bladed jigs, some chatterbaits with you, even have them rigged up so that you can go out and catch fish. Now, one thing that's important to know about a chatterbait is there are certain conditions where it seems like the chatterbait will produce bass better than others. A lot of times when I am using a lure that is loud, that has a lot of vibration, that moves a lot of water, I tend to like a little bit louder conditions for that bait to work the best. So what I mean by loud conditions, sometimes this can simply be having some sort of wind on the water, especially if you're fishing in clear water situations. If you're fishing a very clear body of water and there's no wind out there, there's probably other lures that are gonna work better than a chatterbait. Having that chop on the water really kind of breaks down how far a bass can see and how well that they can see. So when you have that chop, the bass seem to commit to that bait as opposed to following it all the time. Now, another condition that I would consider being loud is anytime you have a high stain or muddy water. If you have low visibility in your water, very muddy, very stained, very dark water, a chatterbait can be a great bait almost anytime in that situation. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite patterns is actually seeking out some stained water during the spring to go throw a chatterbait around wood cover and anything that's available that I think a bass would set up on. Now, if you don't have wind and you don't have low visibility water, another time that the chatterbait may work well is when you have really cloudy conditions. Again, the cloudy conditions are gonna cut down on the visibility, and it seems like the bass just tend to commit to that bait more. But really, as I say with just about any lure out there, if the bass are biting it, the bass are biting it. So no matter the conditions, you can always test it out. If you're getting bit on it, then keep fishing it. When it comes to where you can fish a chatterbait, to be honest, the options are pretty much endless. You can really fish this bait wherever you want to fish it. Now, with that being said, there are a few type of areas. There are a few type of pieces of cover, things that I look for where when I see them, I'm like, all right, a chatterbait is definitely gonna work here. I fish a chatterbait most of the time less than about 5 or 6 foot of water. Now, over the last couple of years, they've actually come out with some chatterbaits that are actually really heavy, baits that are over an ounce of weight, and having a bait that's over an ounce in weight really allows you to fish that bait deeper in 10, 15, 20 foot of water. For instance, if you fish a lot in the Tennessee River and you're fishing a lot of ledges that are in that kind of 10 to 15 foot zone, instead of throwing a crankbait or instead of throwing a jig, a great option might be to throw one of those heavier chatterbaits and actually work it on the bottom kind of like you would a jig, or actually creep it slowly across the bottom. There's no doubt that that would be a great way to mimic one of those bigger gizzard shad that's in that Tennessee strain of lakes. But again, I primarily fish the chatterbait pretty shallow, and one of the first things that I look for is any type of grass. Really, if you think about it, almost any type of vegetation, whether this is a submergent vegetation like coontail or milfoil or hydrilla, or if this is an emergent type of vegetation like reeds or cattails, pretty much anytime I'm around vegetation,
I'm gonna pick up the chatterbait. And one of the biggest reasons is that it simply comes through that vegetation better than a lot of lures. Now, I'm not saying it's always the best lure to use in that situation, but a lot of times if I find myself fishing around vegetation of any sort, more than likely I'm gonna have a chatterbait on the front deck of the boat. And for you guys who thought that this is a green screen behind me, that is a boat. Now, another time that I'm always gonna have a chatterbait or bladed jig rigged up is anytime I'm fishing around docks. And one of the biggest reasons that I like to fish a chatterbait around a dock is because you can skip a chatterbait very, very well. You can skip it way up underneath of a dock, just like you can skip a jig up underneath of a dock. And there's a lot of times when you're fishing around a dock that the bass are actually suspended. For instance, you may be fishing over 20 and 30 foot of water on a big marina dock, but those fish are just below the surface. They may only be 2-3 foot down. That's a great situation where the chatterbait can be dynamite where other lures may fail. But even if you're not fishing really, really deep docks, even if you're fishing docks that are in 5 and 6 foot of water, sometimes bass will still suspend maybe 2-3 foot. Maybe they're just kind of hanging around the middle of that water column. And in those situations, yeah, you might be able to catch fish, you know, on a jig, you know, skipping a jig up under there, or a Texas rig, but sometimes you will get more bites or bigger bites by fishing a chatterbait and keeping that bait around that level that those bass are sitting. Another place that I love fishing a chatterbait is actually down riprap banks. I think a lot of guys, when they go out there fishing and they see a riprap bank, there's a lot of different lure choices that's gonna come to their mind. For instance, a square bill crankbait might be one of the first things that you think of, or possibly a spinnerbait, or even some sort of topwater bait, or maybe even a jig. So with that being said, because other guys are thinking about throwing different lures, that is why a chatterbait can work so well in that situation. If the bass that are living on riprap banks are typically seeing square bills and spinner baits and jigs, they may just get used to the vibration and the water displacement that those lures put off. And then all of a sudden a chatterbait comes flying past them with a different vibration, a different look, and they can really munch on it when you're fishing around riprap. Now, another situation which is similar to the riprap is when I'm fishing around wood cover. Again, a lot of guys, when they see wood, a lot of times they're not always thinking about a chatterbait. Now, one of the biggest reasons a lot of guys don't fish a chatterbait around wood is that if you are using the wrong type of trailer on your chatterbait, that chatterbait actually gets hung up on wood cover a lot. So it's extremely important to use the right type of trailer to match with the cover that you are fishing. But fishing the right trailer around wood cover, that bait comes through that wood cover actually pretty well. And again, a lot of guys are gonna be thinking about throwing a spinnerbait or flipping some sort of soft plastic around that wood cover, and you show them a different presentation and the bass can really hammer a chatterbait around wood cover. Now, the last place that I really love fishing that chatterbait is pretty much any time I'm out there pond fishing. The thing is about a pond is that you typically have a mucky bottom in a lot of ponds. And if it's not a mucky or muddy bottom, sometimes you just have a little bit of that grass, a little bit of that pond scum at the bottom of the pond. And so fishing lures like crankbaits or even bottom bouncing baits can kind of be a struggle at times because you're gonna get that bait in that scum and in that muck and it can foul up your lure a lot. And the other thing is that the fish tend to stay off of that bottom a little bit. They don't always like to pick stuff off of that mucky bottom. So a chatterbait is a great bait to fish anytime you're fishing in a pond because you can keep that bait higher in the water column. Bass tend to like to go up to eat a bait. They don't always love to go down. So you can keep that bait above them in the water column, fishing it in a pond, and you're gonna catch a lot of bass with the chatterbait, the bladed jig. Now, when it comes to how I like to fish a chatterbait, there's really three main retrieves that I have learned with the chatterbait that work really, really well. Now, a lot of guys are gonna pick up that bait, they're gonna cast it out, and they're gonna reel it straight back in. And yes, that will catch you some fish from time to time, but one thing that you can do pretty much with any lure, not just a chatterbait, is if you vary that retrieve, if you speed it up a little at times, slow it down, pause it and let that bait fall for a couple of seconds and then keep on going. Doing that during a retrieve, adding those little twitches really helps you to actually get more bites out on the water because it's going to trigger bass to eating that bait. Sometimes bass are following that bait. They don't know whether they want to bite it, and then all of a sudden you speed it up or you kill it and that bait falls, and bam, that's when a bass gets it. So anytime I am fishing a chatterbait, anytime, I'm always going to change up my retrieve, add a couple of twitches, add a couple of pauses to that bait to help me get a lot more bites with the bladed jig. Now, one of my favorite ways to actually fish the bladed jig, a chatterbait, is actually working it a lot more like a jig than you would a spinnerbait. Typically when I do this is anytime I'm fishing that offshore grass. If I'm fishing hydrilla or milfoil that is offshore, maybe it's in 7 or 8 foot of water, maybe it's coming up to the surface, maybe I have a hard edge. A lot of times one of the best things you can do is cast that bait out, let it sink into the grass, rip it out and let it fall back down. And you're gonna keep ripping it out and letting it fall back down. And you're constantly kind of letting that bait get into the grass, ripping it out, and letting it fall down. Now, I've actually seen it before on certain lakes, especially lakes down in Florida, like the Harris Chain of Lakes or Lake Toho, Kissimmee. Some of those lakes, I have actually seen it where you will not get bit on a chatterbait if you are not working it in that manner. If you're casting that bait out and reeling it, and then every now and then you're killing it and pausing it, kind of like what we talked about earlier, you're actually not going to get bites. But if you rip that bait out and let it fall a ways, sometimes that is the way that bass really like that bait. Now, something that I want to experiment a little bit more with this year is actually using different bladed jigs when I'm working it in that manner. Because what I found out this year is that some bladed jigs actually fall a lot differently than others. For instance, the Guggenbait clickbait, as it falls to the bottom, it actually kind of shimmies back and forth. And anytime you have a bait that has that shimmying action, like a Cinco or like a Strike King red eye shad, anytime you have that shimmy on the way down, it seems like bass really like that. So that is something I'm gonna experiment with a lot more this year when I come to those situations where I'm fishing the chatterbait that way. Now, another way that I love to fish a chatterbait is actually slow rolling the bait. And this is something that I don't think a ton of guys do because I think that they think a chatterbait's going to get hung up, but a chatterbait, a bladed jig, is actually a great bait to just kind of slow roll across the bottom. Now, again, I'm saying slow roll, but still, if I'm slow rolling it, every now and then I'll lift that rod up, let that bait fall, I'll speed it up, I'll slow it down. I'm always varying the retrieve, but for the most part, I'm kind of creeping this bait. And this is something that I actually learned in Ohio. There's a lake in Ohio that I used to fish crankbaits on all the time. But the thing is a lot of other guys always fish crankbaits as well. Like everybody was out there slinging away crankbaits. I decided one day, you know what, I'm gonna pick up a chatterbait and I'm gonna fish it kind of like I would a crankbait. I'm gonna get it there pretty much on the bottom and slow roll that bait. And I started doing that and it was immediate. I started catching fish. I started catching more fish than the guy that was fishing in front of me that day who was fishing a crankbait. And I learned that day how well slow rolling a chatterbait can be, especially if you're fishing in a lake like that. If you're fishing around a lake that just crankbaits are notorious for being a great bait, you know, sometimes that's lakes like Table Rock Lake or Bull Shoals Lake, you know, those lakes are kind of known as crankbait lakes. Slow rolling that chatterbait is a great way to do something different and get a lot of bites. Now, the last way that I fish it is pretty much the standard way. It's kind of like fishing it like a spinnerbait. Anywhere I'm gonna fish a spinnerbait, I'm gonna fish the chatterbait, but again, that's mostly just casting it out and reeling in, but during that retrieve, again, speeding it up, slowing it down, letting it fall from time to time, that's greatly gonna help you to get more bites on a chatterbait.
If you guys enjoyed this detailed approach to fishing a chatterbait, I did a very similar video on fishing a jig, which I'm going to leave right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, click on this one next. Thanks for watching the video, comment below, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.